cover style thing.
We're waiting for it to start. Ah, and there we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Here we go. It happens to me every time. I have to figure out how to mute the
Why not do that?
it happens to me every time. I have to figure out how to mute the YouTube on my system here. It drives me crazy.
Okay.
That's the way to do it. My apologies, folks. Okay. I think that fixed it. I hope. Uh, did you guys get a message that the recording had stopped? No, it's still going. Okay. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for your tolerance there. I'm Harvey Ferdman. I'm the president of the Maryland Heights Township Democratic Club. And I'd like to introduce Sydney Jackson. She's the president of the Creve Coeur Township Democratic Club.
Hi,
Hi,
everyone.
Sydney. And we'll start the meeting with a quick Pledge of Allegiance. If you'll all join in. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. And we have a number of elected officials and also people who are candidates. If you would like to take a moment and introduce yourselves, that'd be great. Maybe start with Tracy.
Sure, happy to do that. Hi, everybody. I'm State Senator Tracy McCreary, District 24. It's great to be here tonight. I think we might have a good turnout because it's getting darker earlier, so it's harder to door knock at 7 o'clock at night these days, and the rain maybe kept some folks in tonight. I'm glad to be here. I hope we'll have a chance to talk at the end of the meeting about the importance of doing everything we can between now and November 5th.
Thank you. Gretchen?
Yeah, this is Mike Feldman, her husband. She's actually on a different Zoom, but she's within earshot. So I'm going to listen in for her, and if I hear something that she wants to hear, I'll let her know.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Do we have other candidates or elected officials? Please introduce yourselves.
I thought I saw LaDonna.
Yeah, there's LaDonna.
Hello, everyone. I'm LaDonna Applebaum. I'm state representative in the 71st district, which is most of Creve Coeur and unincorporated parts of St. Louis County. I'm very happy to be here tonight to learn more about this. Not happy about the rain, because when it rains, my dogs are miserable and they cry. Seriously, Charlotte is not happy, so I will be on mute most of this evening because of storms. But anyway, it's great to see everybody here, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help your election or any issue because I don't have an opponent this year. So I'm up for helping people that need help. So let me know. All right. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any other folks who are either office holders or candidates or representing a candidate? Okay, hearing none, I will, we can move on to talk about our speaker tonight, Professor Ken Warren. Ken conducts research in the areas of American politics, polling, elections, and national policy. He also conducts polls for the media, government, and other clients. As you see on the screen, his presentation is going to talk about the presidential and the Missouri statewide elections. Professor Warren has made many television appearances, including CBS Evening News, ABC News, NBC Nightly News, CNN Inside Politics, MSNBC, CNBC, CNN. You guys get the idea. It goes on for another paragraph. So I think you'd much rather hear Ken than me read that. So with no further ado, Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harvey, and thank you all for tuning in. I spoke to this group before, and I enjoyed very much. I'm a Democrat myself, political scientist. I try to be as objective as possible, however, as a political scientist. I'm a political scientist first, a Democrat second, so to speak, I have to be in order to keep my job. I have, good and bad news for, those in the Democratic Party tonight, but I will call it like I see it, and I will look forward to questions afterwards so I can clarify my comments. I first want to talk about polling. Now, for those of you in these Democratic clubs, a lot of you might know all about this, but I'm going to go over it anyway to just introduce polling to you, because I just don't want to go and just present results, or I could get through that in 10 minutes. So I want to give you a background. I'm a pollster myself. I've written books and a lot of articles on polling. I am the associate director of the SLU YouGov poll. And it's first, we like to boast about this. It's the first and only academic poll in Missouri. So it was a great thing when we started this. It took like decades to start this poll, by the way, to get funding for it and so forth. But it's been very cost effective because for those of you who follow polls, and I'll get into this in a minute, but we get cited across the United States in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and very importantly, because political junkies check these out almost on a daily basis. For instance, Real Clear Politics, Nate Silver's 538, 270 to win. We are represented on those sites. And so we feel that we've done a good job attracting national attention by conducting polls, and we focus on Missouri. So let me say a few things about what you should know about polling, because polls have always been controversial. In fact, when I wrote a book a couple decades ago on polling, it was called In Defense of Public Opinion Polling. And the reason for that is I used to, on TV and on the radio and the print media, I used to give a lot of interviews. And particularly on radio shows, people used to call in and they would just, like to trash pollsters. And most of these people, in all due respect, really didn't know what they were talking about. Polls historically have had their ups and downs, but mostly ups. Polls have been rather reliable, and I know that you're going to have questions about that, but they've been rather reliable over the years. What constitutes reliability is another question, but they still, are a good indicator. So what is the main goal of a pollster, bullet point number one is getting a representative sample. It is always the number one goal of pollsters. And that means if N is not representative N. Now, what does N mean? That is the sample. If it is not representative N, which is a population universe, let's say the state of Missouri, for instance, in our SLU YouGov poll, that would be the population universe. The 900 people we interview would represent N. But that N would have to be drawn very carefully in order to get a representative sample of people in Missouri overall. And we feel we do. In fact, one comparison is to look at, and we'll do that in a few minutes, we will look at our poll results versus other polling on candidate races and ballot issues in Missouri. Now, one thing I would like to talk about for a few minutes is the dramatic changes in polling methodologies. From the gold standard to what I call creative hybrid, no standards in quotation marks, because it really doesn't mean literally there are no standards in modern polling, but hybrid polling, no standards polling with proper weighting being the key to accurate poll results. So let me explain that. The polling started in the 1930s, quotation marks, scientific polling with George Gallup. And he polled in the 1936 election. He became very famous overnight for getting it right. He had these big fights with Literary Digest, the editor of Literary Digest over polling. And the editor of Literary Digest considered George Gallup an upstart. He didn't like him at all, and they literally got into, quite vehement arguments over polling methodologies. Well, Gallup won out because Gallup did engage in an attempt to poll scientifically, while Literary Digest, they were farcical, really, and we're only lucky that they got other elections right. I mean, literally very lucky. And let me tell you why. Going into the 1936 election, they predicted that Alf Landon would actually, win. FDR won in a landslide election. And who did Gallup poll? Gallup polled people who, this is the height of the Depression, by the way. Gallup polled people who own cars, people who own telephones, and people who subscribe to Literary Digest. Well, can you imagine how unrepresentative that was, because he was polling essentially the wealthiest people in the United States. So polling for years was done in a way that was fairly, though, unrepresentative, even in Gallup's attempt to make it scientific. He used stratification sampling, which meant that he tried to get samples of the proper samples of religious people, by economic strata, by every demographic you can imagine. He tried to get proper representations of, for instance, white voters, black voters, Hispanic voters, and so forth. The thing about that is we do that today because we have to, but it's not the gold standard of polling. What is the gold standard of polling? That was really introduced after the 1948 election, when so many pollsters got it wrong, including Gallup. But actually, Gallup was a lot closer in 1948 than he was in 1936. It's just that he got it right, quotation marks. He picked that FDR would win in 1936. But in 1948, he picked Dewey to win. And of course, Dewey lost to Truman, but he was much farther off in predicting the election results. So in the early 50s, methodologists started thinking about, that's survey research methodologists, started thinking about how can we really improve polling? And then they started to go to random sampling. Random sampling using landline phones became in very short order the gold standard of polling, because literally by the 1960s, most people by far had landline phones. As we go on in years, you could reach about 95% of American households through landline phones. And it was so easy to do that. And so polling was inexpensive. We used what was called random digit dialing. So all we needed to do is get the phone numbers in the population universe, and then tell the computer to randomize a random sample. So it was pretty easy to do, and polling results were very accurate. Now, though, since 2008, I picked that number because in 2008, about 18% of Americans now had cell phones. And cell phones have done polling in. It's made it very difficult to poll anymore. And with each passing year, it went from 18% to 26% to 40-some percent. Pretty soon, virtually everyone had cell phones. And cell phones are not good for pollsters. Excuse me. There are many things wrong with cell phones from the point of view of a pollster. First of all, federal laws, and in the next bullet point, I talk about that, but federal laws prevent pollsters from dialing directly cell phones without permission and using a computer to do so, like we used to use when we called landline phones. So it makes it very difficult to reach a cell phone user and in a legal way. So cell phones also, even if you get permission, and that's possible, you get permission beforehand, you set up panels and you get people to cooperate and participate in these hybrid polls where cell phones are involved, internet panel polls are involved, social media is involved. The problem is when you contact cell phone users, they frequently aren't at home. I mean, compare that to landline phones, where when you call a landline phone, they are at home. And we were able to call landline phones at mostly appropriate hours. Of course, you can't always guess right, but most times we were able to call them, after 5 o'clock to about 8:30 at night, and on weekends, and reach a lot of respondents very quickly. You can't do that with cell phones. Frequently, they don't live even in the state that their cell phone number, where they first got a cell phone. And I asked my students that, how many have a cell phone? Everyone raises their hand, yes. How many have a cell phone that's linked to where you live now? And virtually no one has a cell phone to where they live now. So you imagine how difficult that makes it for pollsters. I mean, students at St. Louis U are from California and New York and Illinois and so forth. So if you're doing a poll in Missouri, what are the chances of you reaching people who live in Missouri? It's a lot better chance of that than doing a poll, let's say, of St. Louis County voters, or I've done some polling for Ray Hartman and a couple polls for him, and trying to, let's say, get a sample in St. Louis County with cell phones involved. The smaller the population universe, the more likely when you reach a cell phone, even legally, you're not going to have a great chance of reaching a person who actually has a cell phone number linked to where they live right now. So let me, since I've talked about federal regulation as much as I want to, let me just go right to the problems that modern that pollsters have met. Let me just say that they do try to get it right. They spent a lot of money trying to get a representative sample. Pollsters like me have essentially been wiped out. I do still do polls, but I subcontract, just like St. Louis University does. We make up the poll. The way I poll is I make up the poll. That is the questions. I process the poll, but I don't administer it. And that is common. If you go to these sites like realclearpolitics.com and so forth, you will notice that when you look at a poll, you will find that there are very few of them that where there's only one polling organization representative. So ours is the SLU/YouGov poll. We make up all the questions, we interpret the data, we write up the data, we present the data, we distribute it to the media and so forth, but we don't actually administer the poll. And the reason for that, I think you can understand from what I already said about these different hybrid polls that have developed. They're very expensive to do. Setting up internet panel poll is very expensive, particularly when you mix it with other forms of reaching people. And only the largest polling organizations have the resources to do that. And so they're doing polls for hundreds of clients, and sometimes the client, like St. Louis University, is represented in the poll. So it's called the SLU YouGov poll, or it's called the New York Times Siena poll, and so forth. So polling has, come a long way, but I'm not sure it's gone on the right track because a lot of compromises have had to be made. What does APOR think of polling today? APOR is the American Association for Public Opinion Research. They are an organization that tries to uphold best practices in polling. Well, to make a long story short, people at APOR are not happy with the direction polling has gone. About 5 years ago, the president of APOR said that he had no confidence in polling today because the pollsters have adopted all sorts of methods not previously deemed as acceptable to pollsters. Now that's a long story, but internet panel polls are not, inherently random. People who participate in them, as the APOR president said, are nothing but professional interviewees or respondents. So you have problems with bias. Now, people running these polls, as APOR said most recently, they think better about these polling techniques, but they're not at all ideal. They violate a lot of basic canons in polling methodology. So are polls accurate? Can you trust them? So I mentioned that I wrote a book defending polls. I know I still defend polls today because, as Nate Silver claims, he's the polling guru. He doesn't poll himself, but he has a site called 538. I'm sure practically all of you are familiar with that site because it's another go-to site like 270win or realclearpolitics.com. Because if you want to see who's winning and losing, he handicaps the races. But he uses polls mostly to do that. And he does a lot to scrutinize who's doing the polling, what are the polling firms' records and so forth. But he does conclude that in his test that polls recently have been fairly accurate, despite the fact that they have compromised old standards in public opinion polling. If he also asked, as all of us do, if not polls, what else provides for better predictions? You see, the thing going for polls is that if you use a lot of other kinds of models, they're trying to guess more than in polling what, let's say, economic conditions mean, what does rising inflation mean, what does recession mean, and so forth. I mean, I just read an article where inflation has been unlinked to as far as a predictive measure since the 1940s. It just hasn't been predictive. Presidents have won with high inflation, low inflation. It just doesn't seem to be predictive. Recessions tend to be more predictive, but they're not, really great models. You can use all sorts of other models like the stock market models and betting models. I mean, there are loads of models out there, and not any of them really are as accurate as polling overall. Why? Because when you conduct a poll, you're taking in consideration the economy and everything else, because you're asking people, regardless of whether the economy is on an upturn, downturn, regardless of this issue or that issue, regardless of the wars we're in and so forth, who are you going to vote for? So you cut to the chase right away, and the respondent processes all that and says, well, I'm going to vote for Harris, or I'm going to vote for Trump. And so, you'd have to admit, when you think about it, if you trust the methodology, that polling is overall pretty accurate. Now, polling is more accurate in general elections than polling in primary elections, because you might be thinking about the Keogh-Ashcroft race, for instance. Well, that was a primary. The problem with primaries is that you're interviewing, by and large, for the gubernatorial primary, you're only interviewing Republicans. So Republicans, when you're only interviewing Republicans, and partisanship is really not playing a role now, it means that it's a more volatile climate. People can shift from Ashcroft to Keogh to Igoe pretty quickly because they're all Republicans. And the loyalty is not as steadfast as it is when you're measuring a general election, where you're measuring, or you're polling Democrats and Republicans, where almost all the Republicans are going to vote Republican and almost all Democrats are going to vote Democrats. So therefore, you have great stability when you have partisanship involved. Partisanship is the greatest determinant of vote choice. Image second, and issues a dismal last, by the way. And I will get to that in a minute, because I can show that blatantly in the poll data that I have. By the way, in the Bush-Bell race, the polls were extremely accurate. They predicted that Bell would win by around by about what was it? 7%, and he won by 6.9%. In the Republican primary, it was way off. Most polls showed it was dead even between Ashcroft and Keogh, or even Ashcroft actually ahead by 3%. As you know, the polls were very, very off in that. Keogh won with 39% of the vote. Ashcroft actually came in third with 23%, and Igoe had about 34%. So the polls couldn't have been more off. Igoe was supposed to get about 16% of the vote going into the to that primary, and he ended up doubling that. A quick look at 2016, 2020, and 2022. to make a long story short, the polls were pretty accurate. I know there's a lot of things you read where, you know, opinion or op-ed pieces will say that the pollsters were wrong. Actually, 2016, Nate Silver had Clinton winning, you know, a couple months before the election with an 89% chance. But by the time he actually called it, it was down into the 60s, and he still gave Clinton a chance to win, but Trump was closing very quickly. And so it wasn't surprising to me when it was somewhat surprising, I have to say. But if you look at the poll data right at the end of that election, Trump was closing very quickly in key battleground states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. And that's what cost her. She assumed that she would win that election. Worst thing a candidate, I do polls for candidates. I always tell them it's the worst thing you can possibly do is assume you're going to win. Hillary did assume she was going to win. She even held, you probably heard, meetings the weekend before to set up her cabinet. Now that's, you know, pretty ridiculous in retrospect, but she was literally doing that. I know some people who went to it, and she was planning her cabinet, you know, really counting her chickens before they hatched. So in 2020, the polls did predict with incredible accuracy the race results in key battleground states. Now, if you recall how close they said it was going to be in Georgia, and that Biden was going to win Georgia, that was the big thing in 2020, going right in the last few weeks. It is like, oh my God, Biden can actually win Georgia. Polls are showing that he's just, you know, ahead of Trump. Well, he won by just, you know, a few thousand votes. And he won also in Arizona, you know, by a slight margin. He won in Pennsylvania by about what was predicted, as well as in Michigan. He lost in North Carolina by about what was predicted, by around 2%. He lost by around 1.7%. So the polls, and even Nevada was another one I didn't mention, and Nevada was pretty accurate as well. Where it was off, were in a lot of races, I don't think the pollsters spent a lot of time with, that they were off, according to academic research, they were off in some of the states by wider margins than they should have been. But overall, the polling was pretty accurate in the battleground states in 2020. Polls were very accurate in 2022 in predicting Senate and rep races. So what does the margin of error mean? I don't think a lot of people really know what it means. They might think they know, but what does it mean? If a race is showing that Trump is going to win 50 to 48 over Harris, in Michigan, let's say, the opposite is true. So let me put it this way, a better way for Democrats. Harris is ahead in Michigan slightly. So by around 2%, depending on the polls you look at, but about 2%. So let's say she's predicted to win by 47 to 45, with the rest undecided. And they've interviewed 500 people. That would give you a plus or minus error margin of 4%. 400 interview would be a plus or minus of 4.5. 600 would be 600 would be 4%. I'm sorry, 500 would be 4.5%. So let's take the 600 interviewed for plus or minus 4%. It would mean that Harris could have a maximum of 51% or a low of 43%. But in with what's called 95% confidence, that the poll prediction would be within that error margin. But note that it's a rather wide margin, technically. And I say technically for a reason, that it could be as high as going from 47 to 51, or it could go from 47 to 43. With 95% confidence, it would be within that error margin. But, and this is important to say, because some reporters I know I've talked to they don't get this. But with the greatest probability of the poll being right as to what it was predicting, 47, 45. So it's like a bell-shaped curve with the 47, 45, and then as you get into the margins, there would be a lesser probability that it would be, for instance, 51% for Harris or 43. The greatest chance would be that it would be the 47% that was shown. Because I've had people tell me, well, it doesn't make any difference because it's, it's within the margin of error of 4%. And I would say to reporters sometime, yeah, but would you rather be ahead 47, 45%? And they understand what I'm saying to them. And they say, yeah, I guess I would. So I've already touched on this, and for sake of time, I will go over this very quickly. Political junkies love to follow polls daily. I do. Here's where to find some of them below. And if you're recording this, you can, go to these, which you are recording this, you can go to these sites and look at the polling. What kind of strikes me as, with a lot of my friends, as much as they follow politics, they've never heard of these sites. Many of them never heard of these sites. And to a real political junkie, they would know these sites because they would go to these sites on a daily basis. It's so easy. They're very user-friendly. And I will, call up a couple of these and just show you what we're looking at here. Okay, so here's Real Clear Politics. Probably many of you have gone to this site. You can ask me questions about it. Now you see here's Sunday's polling. It's only Monday, so it's very recent polling. And it shows that nationwide, CBS poll shows Harris is up by 4%, and NBC shows that Harris is up by 5%. Now, that might seem great to you.
Ken, the screen didn't change.
Oh, it didn't? So let me...
I think you need to stop the share and then share the screen that you're looking at.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. You can see it now, right? You should be able to see the screen now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so if we scroll down on this, we would see the all the poll data, that recent polls, and then we could see it in battleground states and so forth, because up top here, like I say, it's a very friendly site. You can go to all sorts of polls. Trump versus Harris, you can do it by state, and that's what you really want to look at. You want to look at how they're doing in the states. Let me just show you this quickly. I won't go to all the sites because I'll take more time on it. Yeah, well, that happened to me earlier, so I guess I won't go to that. I don't want to end the Zoom meeting. Let me see. I'm going to go back to share the screen. I'm going to go back to my lecture because it gave me an error before. I'm not sure why, but Okay, so in those two polls that you saw there that were done yesterday or released yesterday, Harris was ahead by 4 in one and 5 in the other. And you say, well, that's great. Well, according to Nate Silver's handicapping, the Democrat better be leading by around 7% nationally to win. Now, the reason for that is that is based on how it translates into the battleground states. As you recall, Hillary Clinton won by, I think it was the popular vote by 3,900,000, something like that, if I remember correctly. That's a lot of votes. I mean, Bush won by 537 votes, as you recall, in Florida in 2000. So put that in perspective. Hillary won by a lot of votes. Al Gore, by the way, nationwide won by, I think it was 540 something thousand in 2000. So Democrats, as you probably know, can win the national vote. Biden won it by 7 million, by the way, and just squeaked by to win the Electoral College. I mean, it ended up that he won the Electoral College by a lot because he just won narrow margins in state after state. And of course, the Electoral College is inherently undemocratic, but that's for another day. The Electoral College vote normally does not translate into popular vote. There's no relationship. You can win the popular vote by like what Hillary did by quite a bit, and then lose the Electoral College vote. So understand that in order to win the Electoral College, you would like to see Harris winning nationally by about 6 or 7%. I'm not sure, that's anchored in concrete, but that's what Nate Silver said based on past history. But it might be different this time around. Maybe Harris could only be ahead by around 5%. But because Democrats are very aware of the importance of these battleground states that Hillary Clinton took for granted in 2016, Harris is campaigning very hard in those key battleground states. She can afford to lose Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina. She cannot afford to lose Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. That's where it's going to be won or lost this time around. And by the way, she's ahead in all three of those states right now, but she's not ahead by, much. So let me get to what our polls have shown. Okay. Do you see that now?
Yes.
I just shared the screen, and you should see SLU YouGov analysis. That's on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's go to the ballot proposition. I'll get the candidates. One thing I want to say, too, is that you will notice that Democrats favor these ballot issues overall. And yet, Republicans are going to likely win these statewide elections. So there's a disconnect between between partisanship, let's say, and the issues that people favor. And it's not even close. In the Amendment 3 is going to pass by a bundle in Missouri. all the polls show this. I won't go into all of them, but here's what we show. It's very similar to what other polls are showing. That Amendment 3, the abortion rights essentially amendment, is going to, here's what we show. Yes, no. Okay, so voters say they're going to vote for it 52 to 32. That's by 52 to 34. I'm sorry, 52 to 34, with 80% of Democrats supporting it and only 32% of Republicans. Yet 32%, considering most issues or divisions between Democrats and Republicans, that's not that much of a difference. It's 20%, but relatively speaking, that's not much of a difference. A lot of Republicans are going to be voting for Amendment 3, and that's why it's going to pass by a wide margin, probably over 60%, somewhere right around 60%, 59, 63, somewhere around there. Because if you look at the undecideds are not sure, there's only 14. So, a pollster would say, well, how can it fail? Because even if you added the 34 and 14, it would only come to 48. And of course, that's not going to happen. All these undecideds are not going to all vote for on the no side. In fact, it's more likely that most of them will vote yes, because if you break it down proportionally, which pollsters frequently do, you would break it down in this 52 to 34 ratio. So Amendment 3 is going to pass, and yet Republicans as a party are adamantly opposed to Amendment 3, and we're in a conservative state now, and yet Amendment 3 is going to pass easily, just as Medicaid expansion passed, despite the Republicans in the state adamantly opposing that as well. So you will notice the disconnect. It's a real big disconnect, by the way, in St. Louis County. You look at Ann Wagner, I'm not St. Louis County, 2nd Congressional District. You see Ann Wagner being a very staunch pro-life advocate, but her district is staunchly against her position on the pro-life, pro-choice issue. Support for sports betting. Again, 50% are for it, 30% against it, 21% are not sure. But again, the odds of that passing, there's a 20% gap there, so it looks like it's going to also pass easily. And Democrats are more supportive of that than our Republicans. So Democrats, in other words, seem to be on the right side of the issues, and they're still losing elections in Missouri. Sort of ironic, but it's understood in the context of partisanship, because partisanship, as I mentioned, is the greatest determinant of vote choice. All that means is Republicans are going to vote for Republicans and Democrats are going to vote for Democrats, regardless of the issues. The media play up issues all the time as if it's, a big deal. It should be in a democracy, but it's not. Partisanship trumps issues by a wide margin. There are so many examples of that. Republicans used to be most unsupportive of the Soviet Union and then Russia and their leadership. And only about 5% of Republicans were supportive. When Trump became president and pumped up Putin and pumped up Russia, it went from 5% support to 49% support. Now, what that means is that they simply went with Trump, and Trump was able to change their opinion. Why? Because they were supporting the Republican side of it, not necessarily the issue itself, but they were supporting it because Trump was pumping pumping up Putin and Russia. Minimum wage. also going to pass very easily, something that, as you can see, the Democrats greatly favor and the Republicans do not. Although it's fairly popular with Republicans too. I mean, it's 37% of Republicans favor its passage as well. It's not that much below 50%, 13%. But a plurality of Republicans do say no to it. Okay, so let me get rid of this screen and okay, so it's 7:52. I want to get through the rest of this rather quickly so we go to questions. This one I'm not going to go over except to mention this. This is the disconnect too. The Republicans push, non-gun control in the state of Missouri, but the people overall in Missouri are overwhelmingly in favor of gun control measures. You're probably aware that that's true nationally as well. And yet you have the state legislature and the governor and courts ruling to, rule against or vote against gun restrictions. Again, people in Missouri are overwhelmingly according to our poll data and other poll data, on gun control measures. So finally here, let's get to the bad news. So here's poll data again on the election of the presidential race in Missouri. 54% in Missouri will vote for Trump, 41% for Harris. And notice this is very important. Only 3% are unsure, undecided. Well, you can imagine all the money that is spent in campaigns is very cost ineffective. Now, in textbooks, in presidential elections textbooks, they talk about this because there are whole sections and chapters on campaigns don't matter. Now, that's a funny thing to say, but it's said in this context. We are what, 6 weeks away or so from the presidential election. And yet all this money, so to speak, is targeted at 3% of the voters. As you can see here, 54 and 41, that adds up
We
to
can't see.
95%. Go ahead, Nancy.
We don't have the right slide up.
We
Oh,
don't see anything about Trump or Harris on your screen, on our screens.
thank you. It should be up now. Is it up now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for telling me that. So here we go, to repeat, 54% in Missouri say they'll vote for Trump, 41% for Harris, 3% right here, 3% say they're unsure or undecided. My point is that if you think about this, all this money spent and something like $18 billion was spent in the presidential race by the parties, the candidates, and PACs, most of the money spent by PACs in the 2020 election. So all of this money, practically all of this money is spent to try to persuade 3% of the voters. So there's two ways of looking at it. One is to say in textbooks, elections don't matter, and the authors explain to the students that the reason this argument is made by political scientists sometimes or often is because in most races, the money is not going to make the difference because partisanship is going to make the difference, and people have already made up their minds. Now, you could say that about the races, and I feel badly even saying it, but the odds, as you will see, of these Democratic candidates statewide in Missouri winning is very low because they're well behind. But think of all the money, for instance, Kuntz is spending in order to try to win. I think Kuntz is a great candidate, by the way, but the odds of him beating Hawley, an incumbent, in 2020, by the way, every incumbent U.S. senator won election. They all won re-election, 100% of them. 93% on average of U.S. reps win re-election. The powers of, or the advantages of incumbency is very strong, and it's very difficult to try to beat an incumbent for a lot of reasons. So here's the Senate race. So this poll is showing what, and I'll show in a summary a little later, this poll is showing what all the polls I've seen are showing, that Lucas Kuntz is going to lose to Hawley by around 10%. And this one shows, 11%. And only 4% are undecided. So can Kuntz make up the difference? With only 4% undecided, this would be tough. 95% of the people have already made up their minds. Now, again, what this shows is the strength of partisanship. Virtually all the Democrats are going to vote for Kuntz, and virtually all the Republicans are going to vote for Hawley. And by the way, what this shows too, notice the lack of independence. Why is that? Because pollsters measure, they look at independence, but there are almost no independents, what are called true independents. Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan shows that there's only about 8% true independents, despite the fact that commonly we find 30-some% of the people who say they're independents, but they're not independents. They just say they are. And how do you tell? Because in academic polls, like at the Survey Research Center, University of Michigan, they probe. And so when you say you're independent to the interviewer, understand this is an academic poll, they're going to probe and they're going to say, well, you said you're independent. Do you recall how you voted in 2020? Yes, I voted for Trump. Do you recall how you voted in 2016? Yeah, I voted for Trump. Who did you vote for in 2012? I voted for Romney. How about 2008? I voted for McCain. Now that person says they're an independent. They're not going to be labeled as an independent by the Survey Research Center. They're going to be labeled as leaning Republican and strongly leaning Republican because they've never voted for a Democrat, despite the fact they said they're independent. So here's the governor's race. It's a little closer, but only by 1%. So you got Mike Kehoe over Crystal Quaid, 51 to 41%. Now, again, look at the partisanship breakdown. 91% of Republicans are for Kehoe, 90% of Democrats are for Quaid. What we find here is this is true for all the candidates throughout throughout Missouri. The breakdown is about the same because partisanship is what determines vote choice, and you have the Republican winning in the lieutenant governor's race, 51-37 over the Democrat. You have the same here in the attorney general's race, 51-38, all similar percentages. Secretary of State's race, almost an identical percentage, 54-36. All of them within, quote, the margin of error, all within a few percentage points in terms of the ratio. And here we have finally the treasurer's race, 52-38. So, you know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I cannot see, being objective, how any of these Democratic candidates can win. And I hope for miracles, but it doesn't look good. So just a few more minutes and I will take questions. I mentioned this at the outset. You know, the last time I spoke to your group, I mentioned that Missouri has gone from the best bellwether state during the 20th century to a solid red state. And it's done so only in the last few election cycles. In 2016, a lot of people forget this, but Democrats controlled every statewide office except the lieutenant governor's office. Peter Kinder was the sole Republican in a statewide office. I'm not talking about federal offices. That was split with Blunt and McCaskill. But every statewide office was Democrat. So look at how, you know, how Democrats, ever since 2016, when Trump won by 18.51% of the vote, and he swept into office all these Republicans. So ever since 2016, this has been what I would call, you know, a Republican, a Trump Republican state. And I don't see how it's going to change in the immediate future. Democrats need to really figure out what needs to be done to win back state offices. So here's a summary of what I've talked about in terms of races. In the presidential race, there was an article in the New York Times about how Nate Silver agrees with the Times conclusion that this is a toss-up. This presidential election is a toss-up. It's literally gone back to a 50-50 model form in the Electoral College. It is just too difficult to call. You know, if you look at all these battleground states, it's ridiculous. It's so close in all of these battleground states. Unfortunately, Harris is starting to lose by a greater margin in some of the battleground states that she was looking pretty good in just a week or so ago. And she's losing ground in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. She doesn't need those states, so that's the bright side. But I don't like to see her going from actually having slight leads in some of those states to losing by, you know, 4 or 5%. So our polls, SLU polls, show that Trump would win in Missouri by around 13%, 54 to 41%. An Emerson poll showed that Trump would win by 11%, 53 to 42. So essentially, that's about the same. And summarizing these races here, again, Keogh over Quaid by 10, Hawley over Kuntz by 11. In an Emerson poll, look, it's almost identical. Hawley over Kuntz by 11%, identical to our margin. Keogh over Quaid, 52 to 36 in the Emerson poll, showing a greater margin than our poll. One poll shows that Hawley is only winning by 4%, but beware of red flags. That is an internal poll. It's by a Democratic organization. You always want to be a little skeptical of certain polls, but not always. I mean, I don't, when I do polls for candidates, like Ray Hartman right now, I don't fudge my poll data, and a lot of these organizations do not. So you can't automatically say that just because this is a Democratic poll and they work for Democratic candidates, that they're fudging the poll data. But it's a red flag. I would rather go by our poll or the Emerson poll that are, independent, totally independent polls. So what does all this mean to an electoral behavior scholar? As I mentioned, campaigns don't matter much in one sense, as I explained. Debates matter little in the sense that Republicans think the Republican candidate won the debate. Democrats think the Democratic candidate won the debate. Once in a while, it means something. It did for the Biden debate and Trump. Biden really, his poll numbers just collapsed after that debate, and Trump's poll numbers went down somewhat after debating Harris. So debates can matter. They usually don't very much, and much of the time it's momentary, and then the candidate bounces back. Convention bounces also are momentary and usually tiny, about 2%, if anything. Usually that convention bounce dissipates as well. As I mentioned before, what is clear from poll data is that the greatest determinant of vote choice is partisanship, with obviously almost all the Republicans, who exaggerate a little bit, wanting to vote for Trump, and Hawley, for instance, and virtually all the Democrats wanting to vote for Harris and Kuntz. And so, as I mentioned before, almost all candidates, almost all voters have made up their minds as to who they're going to vote for. And as a result, it's difficult for campaigns to with all the money they're spending, to try to win an election if they're behind, because the most people have already made up their minds, and so you have few people to impact. And the last thing to say is that clearly incumbents have a great advantage over challengers. That's what makes it very difficult for someone like Kuntz to beat Hawley, or for Ray Wagner, for Ray Hartman to beat Ann Wagner. Questions?
Okay, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and shout them out. Do we still need the, that's an interesting slide that's up. Go ahead.
I have a question. I put it in chat.
Oh, okay. What happens to Missouri when Trump loses if he goes to prison? Is that just wishful thinking?
That's wishful thinking. I agree. I don't think he's going to go to prison. I think he should go to prison, but I don't think he's going to. Well, the funny thing is, the Constitution does not prohibit Trump from serving as president from prison. That's shocking to some people, but it's not. The Constitution, and that if you read articles on it, there's no question about it. He can go to prison and serve as president. He can be convicted and go to prison and win the presidential election.
Ken, I think it might be useful if you take down your screen at this point.
Okay.
You need to stop share.
Yeah.
Other questions? There we go.
Oh, yes. Yes, Ken, do these polls that we were looking at take into account all the new, voters who have registered recently? There's a lot of young people we hear that are registering to vote.
No, well, obviously not if they're talking to registered voters. However, some people, we poll likely voters, regardless of whether they're registered or not. I mean, obviously you have to be registered to vote, but that's not the question we ask. We ask them how likely they are to vote, like very likely, like almost certain to vote, very probably will vote, might vote, will not vote, that sort of thing. But that's a good question because some pollsters do measure registered voters. And by the way, when you look at polls, you might, if you're really into them, you would want to click on their methodology. Appor requires, Nate Silver requires that you are totally transparent with your methodology, so you would be able to tell whether or not that poll is polled registered voters, likely voters, or just people eligible to vote, 18 years and over. But by the way, the one comment on that is this. There are good signs for Democrats that young people are registering like crazy. Of course, voting has already begun in many states. So they are registering, they are getting organized. And I just saw, a poll today showing that young voters that is under 30 years old, are likely to vote for Harris by a margin of 21% more than Trump.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, that, more Democrats seem to be, young Democrats seem to be registering potentially. Thank you.
Well, it's all about turnout. That's an exaggeration to say that, but people are always saying, well, it's all about turnout, because turnout is so important. It's not one thing the polls cannot measure. They cannot measure turnout. They can try, but it's one of the biggest criticisms I have of polls. And in our own poll, I said to my colleague, the director of the poll, Steve Rogers, I said, did you see the numbers here on people who said they're going to vote? It's like 90-something% say they're going to vote, when we know the turnout is far less than that. Even in great turnout elections, you'd be lucky if you get 64% turnout. And yet 94% or so, I kid you not, say that they're definitely vote or very likely to vote. It's farcical.
We have a question from David Altman.
Yeah. Yes. Do any polls take in consideration weighting towards the Electoral College? And they would have to look at the polls within each state in order to do that. And then also, do the polls try to weight it towards what's been going on in the past with different age groups voting?
Yeah, well, weighting, I said in my lecture here, I talked right away when talking about polling, I talked about weighting is key. Weighting for demographics is very critical, so you get a representative sample. Yes, pollsters have these weighted models in light of the Electoral College. And so what they make predictions based on polling in the context of how the polls are going in the key battleground states, and you've got about 7 of them. And it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't matter what the polling is nationally. It matters to pollsters how these candidates are doing in the key electoral college states, because about 43%, about 43 out of the 50 states don't even matter, in the sense that they're either Democrat or the Republican states. So as you know, all the focus is on about 7 states. So again, that national poll is encouraging because it shows Harris ahead in the last 2 by 4 and 5%. But it doesn't mean diddly squat to me. What's meaningful to me is how Harris is polling in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. If she wins those, she's going to win the election.
Right.
And
So
she
why
is ahead in those right now.
So my thing, it is very irritating to see these, you know, news media when they do the national polls, because most of anybody that's politically in the know, such as us, we know that it's worthless. So it doesn't mean much. So it's like, it just seems like wasted time, those polls. So why do you have any reason why can you say why a lot of media why do they publish these polls? It's like, or why do they?
Well,
talk about
but like you say, you know what to pay attention to as someone who's astute politically. I think there's value in doing a national poll, because what you're looking at is the national sentiment. It's discouraging to political scientists because there are very, very few political scientists that like the Electoral College. It has always discriminated against Democrats from the very beginning, from the 1824 election on. You know, 5 Democrats have won the popular vote and lost the election, you know, in the Electoral College. 5. All of them Democrats. It never happened to a Republican. But the Electoral College is inherently undemocratic. As I say to students who try to defend it, I said, well, how fair do you think it is in a state like California, with all those electoral votes, with all those millions of people? I said, if your candidate loses by 1 vote, theoretically, all those people who voted for that candidate get no representation in the Electoral College. Now, how inherently undemocratic is that?
Yeah.
I have a question. You said that Kamala Harris has lost ground. Amongst what demographic is that?
Well, she's losing ground by a few percentage points in 3 states: North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. And probably the demographics are a little different. You know, when you only go down by a couple percentage points, it's going to be difficult to see where she's lost ground. Supposedly she's lost a little among men again. You know, there's a gender gap of 14% of men favor Trump over Harris, and 12% women favor Harris over Trump. So there's a gender gap both ways. Hopefully for Democrats, women vote more than men in general, and particularly Black women vote a lot more than Black men. And hopefully that the voting turnout among women can make the difference up. One thing, by the way, to look for in a state poll, because you only have basically men and women. When you see that, as I have seen, it's encouraging that women are favor, you know, Harris by a wide margin in, say, Michigan, that's good news. Because if women favor Harris in Michigan by a wide margin, it's going to be difficult for Trump to win Michigan, because simply more women vote than men, and they're overwhelmingly for Harris.
Excellent. We have a question in the chat. How do we get Missouri out of partisanship?
Out of partisanship? Well, I'm not sure what's meant by that question. You can't get Missouri out of partisanship if he means how can we, you if he means or she means, how can Missouri become more Democrat again? That's going to take probably a disaster in the Republican Party, I think nationally, where there will be what's called a realignment. Then realignments don't happen very often, but some of you listening to this know what a realignment is, because some of you have probably been political scientists and have heard of realignments that happened, after the Civil War, happened basically in 1896 with the McKinley win, in 1932 with the Roosevelt win, in 1964 with the Lyndon Johnson win, that you had basic shifts in the electorate from one party to another. That's what you would need, some crisis to change the alignment.
That was my question in the chat, though, about partisanship. But I'm wondering if there is possibly some difficulty, because I remember when Missouri was much more Democratic and we elected more Democrats, we had Democratic governors and so forth. That was back when Missouri schools were better funded. Ever since 2001 and No Child Left Behind, I mean, public schools we have no time to teach social studies or history. It's all math, science, and communication arts. That's all the time we had. So, and we're the lowest out of 50 states in school funding and teacher pay. So I see a direct correspondence between us becoming a more Republican partisanship state and our lack of ability to educate the children when they're young.
Well, I think that's very well put, and I think that's true. We know that I just saw a study showing Missouri ranked 47th in funding, educational funding. That's pretty pathetic. And I do agree with you also, as a person who teaches students at the college level, what I see is that students come in knowing absolutely nothing about government, their own government. They are just totally oblivious. I think we do know this too, by the way, that plays into what you're saying. In Missouri, it's true in all states, but in Missouri, our poll shows, when we run what are called crosstabs between support for the candidates versus educational level, you see that the worst educated people in Missouri are the ones supporting Trump. And those with college degrees, and particularly graduate degrees, there's a very small percentage of those people supporting Trump.
I don't know, Cheryl, is that a comment or a question in the chat? What she read is, and Trump isn't enough for a big alignment issue?
Well, you would hope so. He certainly has been with some Republicans, okay? There's no question when you see someone like Steve Smith, who ran McCain's campaign, jump parties. George Will, who jumped parties, there's so many others, Liz Cheney, her father. I mean, you think about, Dick Cheney, the quintessential Republican, conservative, along with his daughter, bolting the party. You look at a guy like Bolton, John Bolton. These people, these were diehard conservatives, and they have bolted the Republican Party. It is not the Republican Party of yesteryear. It is a Trump Republican Party. He owns the party. He was able to kill that immigration bill, that slash border bill, immigration bill. That was about to pass. That was sponsored by a Republican from Oklahoma. and I mean, it had more in the Biden wanted to give away the country store in order to get that bill passed. because he wanted an immigration bill. And all my Republicans friends and the commentators will say the same thing. The Republicans on Capitol Hill said there was more in that bill for Republicans than Democrats. And yet Trump killed it because he didn't want Biden or the Democrats going around touting a great immigration reform bill, the most, sincere one since the Reagan administration.
I have a question. Yeah, that I'm still scratching my head with all these people leaving the Republican Party, why they still poll so high. But in any case, you mentioned,
and of course,
that,
we can't forget Conway, who left either, who's made a big deal about it. George Conway.
Yeah.
And formed the Lincoln Project.
And yet the statistics didn't change when that happened. Is that correct?
It absolutely. I mean, the whole thing is rather baffling, even to a veteran political scientist like myself. How anyone could vote for Trump, honestly, to me, is very baffling. It's just baffling. His character is, as Romney said, and I think what Romney said sums it up. When he said why he was not voting for Trump, he said, well, I disagree with him on foreign policy. We're pretty much together on domestic policy. But when it goes to character, that's a deal breaker. And I can't vote for him because of character.
Yeah. So I have another question. You had mentioned that campaigns don't matter much. Can you comment, or have you looked at the Bush-Bell situation and the outside money that came in? If that campaigning from the PACs actually influenced, or do you think the outcome was already going to be Bell independent of that?
Well, okay. Look, that's an excellent question, and that needs an elaborate answer. Okay, AIPAC actually even asked me to do a poll on that. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to take a stand backing AIPAC. Not that I oppose AIPAC, I just didn't want to put myself in the position. But AIPAC spent, and by the way, when I was reluctant to do it, AIPAC made clear to me money was no object. And money has obviously been no object. They spent $8 million bumping, what's his name? Bowen, what's his name? From New York, Bowen. Oh, Bowen, it's not Bowen. And then they, Bowman. Yeah, Bowman. And then they spent $4 million plus here of AIPAC money, backing Bell. But they were targeting squad people. They only could do it to about 2 of them. The other squad members were simply, like AOC, were simply too secure. Money made a difference for sure, because there was, all you had to do is turn on your TV. There was a constant advertising for Bell, not that much for Bush. But my opinion is Bush and Bowman did kind of stupid things politically. You might say, look, principle wise, they have a right to stick to the gun on their principles. But they took tough positions politically, and to think that they could win with the positions they were taking, anti-military funding in a district that's one of the largest defense districts in the United States, was not too bright. Defunding the police, and of course being a staunch pro-Palestinian. It's all right to have any of those positions. I'm just saying that politically, however, it made no sense in her district. Bowman, the same thing in his district. That had a large Jewish constituency, and he was pro-Palestinian too. If you want to win, now you might admire people like that in one sense, because they took a position and they died taking the positions they took. But politically, I thought their positions made no sense.
Are there other questions? Thank you for that answer.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Sandra
Rick,
has a
go ahead.
question. And Rick Gary has a question.
Yes. Hey,
Yes,
Doc.
My friend, by the way, Rick Gary here's.
How you doing? A couple
A
of
very
things.
astute political.
Oh,
Miss Murdoch had her hand up for a good little while.
this
Oh, sorry, I
Carolina
didn't
Farm Board.
see that. How about we have Sandra go first and then
Yeah,
Rick?
I've been puzzled, and maybe you can help me with this question. Why would the Republicans know that Trump is a serious problem, and why are they back? I mean, they're not backing their conservative issues; they're backing him. I just don't under. Can you give me some kind of answer as to why they would just back him? How will that help them politically?
Look, excellent question. And guess what answer I have for you? I have no clue how Republicans, have abandoned the principles they had to back a guy like Donald Trump. It's really mystifying to a lot of people. But Trump, as you know, can bend the knees of Republicans in his party, and he gets his wish. And I gave an example of the immigration vote that he killed, and that was going to pass. That was going to pass. There's no question that was going to pass. Republicans loved it, and everyone on the news was talking about how it was going to pass. Next thing you know, it was dead because Trump killed it.
Thank you. That's crazy.
Rick.
Oh, hey Doc, how you doing?
Doing well.
A couple questions, not many. One of the questions is, I know that the polling for the 2024 election, they changed their algorithm because they were undercounting in the past couple of elections. They undercounted for Trump, so they changed those polling algorithm to compensate for that. Has anyone done a poll on if they had used the same algorithm for the Biden election, what those numbers would be? That's number one. Number two is, why money per se does not change the needle that much in advertising, but what about the ground game? Because the Democrats seem to have spending a lot more dollars on the ground game, especially in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and also now North Carolina, on actually getting volunteers out, and not only spending money. A lot of volunteers come out without money to begin with, to actually register people to vote. What kind of impact will that make? First, the question back to the algorithm, and the second about spending money on actually ground game, as Obama did, by the way.
They actually have done studies on that, mostly comparing 2016. That's where Trump was really, the polling really underestimated Trump. And the polling had a bias that it's called a methodological bias. It's not that they did so on purpose. It's just that their methodology tended to oversample Democrats, undersample Republicans. That's always been a problem because Republicans tend to respond less to pollsters than Democrats. So you have to make adjustments for that. If they had an algorithm that accounted for that Democratic bias, the polls would have predicted that Trump probably would have won that. As I said, polls were showing that Trump was closing very quickly anyway in that 2016 election. So it wasn't totally shocking that Trump did squeak out an election. Your second question was what again? I'm getting tired here.
Spending money on the ground game.
Oh yeah, spending money. I think, of course, you know the answer to that. Spending money on all these ads are cost ineffective. Studies have concluded. I mean, you see them over and over and over again, and people have already made up their minds. But spending money, turning people out to vote, that's spending money wisely, because that's what makes the big difference. It's not what the poll shows per se. That gives you one indication. But when a poll shows that Harris is only up by 1% or 2% in Michigan, she's up by 0.7% in Pennsylvania, she's up by 1% in Wisconsin, you better get those people to the polls. And money will help get those people to the polls to get Harris to hold on to a win if those polls are correct. So turnout is key, as I think all of you know who's watching this. Turnout is key in an election. It doesn't matter what the polls show. I mentioned earlier. I mean, in a sense, what matters is getting people to vote. A lot of people might say to a pollster they're going to vote for Harris, but if they end up staying at home, that's not going to do Harris any good.
Thank you.
Ken, it seems in Missouri that there's a predominance of people who are in favor of Amendment 3. I imagine that means the Democrats are going to actually turn out en masse. Do you think the Republicans have that visceral issue like they've had in the past with abortion to make sure that they turn out, or do you think they may look at some of these folks who are running away from the party, some of their
No,
previous
they
leaders?
don't. And they don't, and they flatly do not. Let me tell you this. Do you know how much money has been given to the pro-abortion side of that? 28 times more than to the pro-life side of that. 28 times more. $5.5 million has been raised by the proponents of Amendment 3, and the other side has given up. They've spent like $880,000. That is it. So I did the math on that today because I was doing research on it, and my eyes popped out when I saw that 28 times more money is spent by the pro Amendment 3. And I think that answers your question in a way. The other side has given up.
So is it possible that the Republicans in Missouri aren't going to have a strong turnout?
No, they will have a strong turnout because they'll turn out for Trump, and they'll turn out for Josh Hawley.
Well, we're over time. I don't know if you're okay with taking a couple more questions or how we're doing.
I'm fine with it.
Are there any other questions? Well, I want to bring up one of my favorite topics, tangential to this, and that's ranked choice voting, and looking at the Republican gubernatorial primary. Keogh got 39%, which means 61% of the people did not vote for him. Ashcroft, I think, got around 30%, and Eigel, I think, also got around 30%. The point being that Ashcroft and Eigel combined got more than 50%, and 61% of the voters did not vote for Kehoe, yet with our current system, he became the candidate. Clearly not people's first choice.
Yeah, but I'm glad Abraham Lincoln won, and Abraham Lincoln only won with 39% of the vote too, by the way. So how would you apply ranked choice voting to that election? Look, we've been electing for a long time minority winners, meaning, minority in terms of percentage winners. It's not unusual. We've a person who even got less was John Quincy Adams in 1824. He got 31% of the vote and ended up winning the election in a weird situation. But I don't know what to think of ranked choice voting. What do you think of it, Harvey?
Oh, I think it's a good idea because then you end up with a true majority preference.
Yeah, well, is that important?
I thought it was in our democracy. I don't know.
Well, if you're trying to come up with a forced majoritarian winner, I guess so. I really have given a lot of thought to it, and I don't know what to think of it, of ranked choice voting, whether it's better or not. A lot of people talk about compulsory voting. Well, that's farcical too. Okay, voting, that would make it even worse, forcing people to vote that know nothing about the election. We already have too many people voting without knowing much about the election.
We have a hand raised. Mary, were you raising your hand? Thought I saw someone raise a hand out there. Oh,
I see Tony's.
You mentioned the results of betting models. Can you elaborate on that?
The betting models. A lot of people think those are pretty good ones because it's putting your money where your mouth is. And those who spend a lot of money betting on the candidates supposedly steady, fairly well, who's going to win, who they think is going to win. Betting models are you should look at it. If you go to Real Clear Politics, they will show the betting model. And the betting model, I think right now favors Trump by a little bit. It did favor him by a lot when he was running against Biden. And then I think betting models started to favor Harris. But see, what worries me is Harris is sort of leveled out in her support. I mean, she came on real fast. It's still good for Democrats because with Biden, the Democrats stood no chance of winning. Right now, I think the Democrats, as Nate Silver says, stands well, in his latest model, I think it's about a 57% chance of winning. The Harris stands about 57% chance of winning. I just went on a site today. I think that's what I recall. It was 57, 59 or something like that.
excellent.
But betting models, betting models make sense in the sense that it's a serious commitment, to who they think will win, and it's not much different than betting on sports and so forth. If people study who they really think is going to win, and the odds makers, the odds usually are pretty accurate, with the point spread and everything. They're usually pretty accurate because lots put into it.
We have a question in the chat. I saw a GOP commentator posit that a Harris presidency with a majority GOP Congress, both houses, would be ideal. What do you say about that? And it terrifies the question asker, but not quite as much as a Trump presidency with a majority Congress, of course.
So a Harris presidency with a Republican Congress?
Yeah.
Well, what you have is, you're going to have you're not going to get much passed, of course, because of the polarization in politics right now. Way back in the 60s, political scientists talk about all the measures that were passed, during the Johnson administration with bipartisan bills. The same continued into the Nixon administration with the passage of OSHA, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Act. But now there's almost no bipartisanship there's a lot of bills have passed with bipartisan support, but they're just minor, trivial issues, procedural issues. But when it comes to major legislation, nothing would pass. If Harris was president, and she faced a Republican Congress, the Republicans wouldn't get anything done because Harris would veto the legislation, and vice versa. If Harris, tried to push bills, they would be dead on arrival in a Republican Congress.
Going back a step to how do you turn Missouri blue? There's one candidate that we both know who has actually pledged to apply to be a part of the Problem Solvers Caucus if elected, and that would be Ray Hartman.
Yeah.
Do you have any comment on the approach of kind of not running around saying Democrat, Republican, but saying I'm going to go and be a part of that Problem Solvers Caucus?
Well, ideally, I mean, it makes sense, but practically speaking, it's it's a big dream. It's going to be very difficult to turn this state blue. Republicans have quite a hold on it now, and it's just become a startling red state. I mean, if you look at the statistics and you compare the votes, like my friend Rick Gary and I were looking at, when you look at South Carolina, where he's originally from, and Mississippi, you see that Missouri, in many cases, votes more conservatively in the U.S. Congress than Mississippi or South Carolina.
Wow.
And there was a study on that. There was a study showing that, on how representatives from Missouri vote versus these other conservative states, and Missouri was number one. This was about 5 years ago, I saw it. But Missouri has become very, very red. Presidential votes, if you compare the votes for Trump in Missouri versus these other states I'm talking about, you'll see that in some of the states, like one, I think in 2016, that South Carolina voted a little more, for Hillary Clinton than Missouri did.
Well, to try to end on a somewhat of an up note, looking at local elections as opposed to statewide, especially in the St. Louis area where most of the people who are online are from, my opinion, and tell me if I'm wrong, is there are many of these races locally that we can have an impact on to continue knocking on doors and working for these candidates, because we're not fighting the rural vote. We have a better
Right.
chance here of flipping some of these local seats.
Oh, Democrats will win a lot of local races, sure, because they're in somewhat safe seats, rep seats and state Senate seats. I would like to see Ray Hartman pull it out in the 2nd congressional district. It's going to be tough, which he knows. I told him, but he's trying hard, and he's raised quite a bit of money, by the way, according to that one poll that I said, he's only trailing by 4, but I'm a little, hesitant to, give a lot of credence to that poll.
How about Joe Peerless?
He's a former student of mine. I haven't really, he's a former student of mine. I don't know about that, how close that race is.
Okay. It's an open seat. That's the good news.
Yeah. Well, open seats. I know I have some other students who are running too, and they're running in open seats. Yeah. So an open seat is where you have the opportunity. You want to win in an open seat.
Yeah. Well, Ken, thank you for extending your time with us and for the whole evening. It's been very informative. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, announcements? Okay, Ken, once again, it's very appreciated. You do good work and have really educated us this evening. So
thank you very
again.
much to the group, to you, Harvey, and to the group.
Thank you. Everyone, take care. See you next meeting.